following their successful first action, capturing the small village of Barrel-sur-Mer. The men of 1 troop, a squadron of the Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry, together with the 2 platoons of infantry and the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, were ordered to move. A crisis had arisen. They were ordered to move to and take up defensive positions in the small town known as Nouv, or simply Nouville as the British troops called it. The town had been badly knocked about in previous fighting, in which a company of French reservists had held the town against a determined enemy attack, pushing them back a few miles to the north. With the enemy launching a renewed offensive, the front line to the east of Nouville was crumbling, and the relatively small scratch force was sent to hold the town whatever the cost. But following their failure to capture it, the enemy had simply bombed the town, destroying much of its buildings and blocking the streets. The town was after all largely used as a through route for Allied forces moving behind but along the front lines, a vital road and logistics hub. Now the British troops had to claw their way through the rubble over obstacles, as Corporal Robinson of 1 Troop, A Squadron, remembers. Well, the French troops that had held the town had built a number of these roadblocks out of furniture and just rubbish from the rubble really. There'd been a great battle here the week before. The enemy had been repulsed quite well. In retaliation, they just bombed the town. Now it was a ruin, and getting our tanks through the streets was quite difficult. However, the small ad hoc formation had been reinforced. 4th Platoon of B Company Rifle Brigade was joined by 5 Platoon, also of B Company 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, and together with the Scouting Platoon, they amounted to a scratch company. And so the entire force came under the command of Major Roberts, the officer commanding B Company of the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade. This, however, posed some problems for the tankmen of the Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry, as Sergeant Ross remembers. I remember seeing the boss walking over to his tank, having had a quick meeting with Major Roberts. He did not look very happy at all, and when the boss briefed us, we understood why. Major Roberts wanted us to spread out our strength, spread our tanks along the infantry line. This, however, was not what we enjoyed doing. We'd rather work together as a troop. That way we could better support each other, act as a more unified unit. But no, we were going to be used as mobile hardpoints. Lieutenant Reese Fraser, OC of 1 Troop, takes up the story. Major Roberts wasn't a bad bloke. He was a very good officer, in fact. He very obviously cared for his men. However, the coordination and cooperation between infantry and tanks was still in its infancy at the time, and unfortunately, he simply did what he felt right, rather than what may have actually been right. He respectfully listened to my advice to have my tanks held back in reserve, or preferably out on the left flank, where the ground was more open and suitable for tank movements. I told him it'd be much better to have my tanks move up as a troop, envelop the enemy, and attack them from the flank. He, of course, was not having it. He saw this as a defensive battle. That's why we were sent there after all. He wanted my tanks spread out along the line where they could provide machine gun fire and anti-tank support directly to the infantry. Of course, the sight of a friendly tank bolsters the infantry in their resolve, and that's what he was banking on. This, of course, was all well and good, but the men of No. 1 Troop couldn't help but notice how the much smaller, lighter and more manoeuvrable vehicles of the 1st Battalion's Scout Platoon were in fact placed out on the left, where they believed their tanks should have been. Those lighter and more manoeuvrable vehicles would have been far better suited in the town amongst the rubble with the infantry. Even Corporal Derrick, the commander of the 2-pounder gun from the 1st Battalion's anti-tank platoon, was not happy with their deployment. The trouble was, the town was so badly knocked about, and the roadblocks that the French had built were still there. So there was nowhere we could set up our gun, and nowhere where the tanks could get decent line of sight, or fields of fire. We would have to wait for the enemy basically to come head on towards us down the streets, and that wasn't very likely. Nevertheless, the men that had formed the B Company battle group, as Major Roberts liked to call it, had to do their best. And finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity of waiting for the men, shots began to ring out. The enemy were attacking at last. a small group of enemy infantry had infiltrated the town, and immediately came under fire from British troops. The whistle and bang of the French mortars landing nearby brought everyone to the stand too. Lieutenant Fraser remembered this moment well. We were too far back. Our whole line should have been further forward where we could cover the open ground to the east. I think we should have been arrayed on the edge of town rather than near its centre, but nevertheless, here is where we were, and the enemy had been able to sneak up and infiltrate the streets and the buildings. 1 minute it was all quiet, the next minute, there they were. Fortunately, B Company had a pair of 3-inch mortars attached to them from their battalion's support weapons platoon, and it was one of these weapons that suppressed the enemy's own support gun that had come in to pummel our positions, knocking out its crew very quickly. Realising that enemy forces were in fact entering the town from the east unchecked, Fire Platoon, holding the centre right of the British line, began to send its sections forwards to cover the open ground to the east, to make it far more difficult for more enemy forces to come in from that direction. As they moved forwards, they came under fire from enemy support weapons that were entering the town from that direction, and the infantry, in close range, came to grips with those gunners, using rifles to bring down the enemy crews and grenades to knock out the enemy guns and their ammunition supplies. But now there was another problem. The advance guard of an enemy reconnaissance battalion was now approaching and attacking. This battalion was the same battalion to which belonged the recce platoon that had been defeated in the earlier operation. The lieutenant in command of Fire Platoon radioed back to Major Roberts, requesting artillery support on the enemy forming up area to the east. And whilst the fire mission was being put through, Corporal Richardson in Alpha 1-2, holding the right flank of the Allied position, pushed his tank further right and forwards, hoping to envelop the enemy's flank as his OC had wanted to do from the left. At his current position, he could not get shots on target, and so wanted to move his tank forwards, up the street, where he could engage. Seeing this, Lieutenant Fraser also ordered his own tank to also follow. The two tanks pressed up, using the houses for cover, as the barrage began to land around the enemy forces. This bombardment had held up the enemy's attack, as the men took shelter. As Corporal Richardson's tank broke cover from the houses, its gun sight immediately fell upon the enemy Panzer I, side on and extremely vulnerable. However, an enemy 20mm anti-aircraft gun, acting in the ground support role, now opened fire on Corporal Richardson's tank, slightly damaging both tracks. And of course, the crew of Alpha 1-2 returned fire with both the 2-pounder gun and their own machine guns, before turning their attention back once again to the Panzer I that had been immobile out in the field. Lieutenant Fraser now pushed his tank left once again to move up behind 5 Platoon in the centre right of the Allied line. This position seemed to be where the main enemy effort was focusing, and the 2-pounder gun was also moved to support the defence here. And it was as 4 Platoon began to move up to take up new positions towards the northeast, from where they could more easily support the defence in the area around 5 Platoon, that a major enemy assault began. It was preceded by bombardment from enemy support guns, but the British 3-inch mortars took a terrible toll upon the enemy attackers. A platoon attack had been taking place, and it had been caught out in the open, and the men had begun to cluster on the road. Machine guns and mortars began to rip through them. However, the crew of one of the 2 3-inch mortars from the British line was destroyed by a direct hit from an enemy support gun. But the machine guns of Lieutenant Fraser's tank shredded the enemy attack as they moved forwards across the open ground. Meanwhile, on the centre left, 4 Platoon and their supporting mortar had begun to engage the enemy that had tried to push its way into the town. Here it was Sergeant Ross's tank that was in action, and he pushed his tank forwards to engage the enemy crews of the support guns that had infiltrated that part of the town, bringing down an anti-aircraft gun crew and a machine gun crew. Having seen their attack by their infantry swept from existence, the enemy now began to engage from afar with their support weapons and vehicles. These, one by one, were being knocked out by the tanks of the Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry, particularly Corporal Richardson's tank on the far right, was able to fire across the enemy's line. However, Corporal Richardson, a very capable tank commander, had to be very careful how he operated, he had to keep engaging and retreating back into cover whenever his tank came under fire from those very same support weapons. One of the enemy armoured cars that he had engaged earlier was now out of control, driving around in circles in the field, and this alone caused some problems for the attackers. The infantrymen forming up nearby had to scarper lest they be run over by their own vehicle. Almost in the dead centre of the British line, George 1-1, the close support tank that had also helped reinforce one troop after the loss of George 1-2 in the previous operation, had now come under heavy fire from a number of enemy anti-tank guns. They basically shot the tank to pieces, killing its crew one by one. The men inside were being picked off. They were unable to escape. At last, only the driver remained, and as he tried to reverse, the tank was hit once again, the driver being killed. The entire crew had very quickly been wiped out. That meant that in the space of 24 hours, a squadron of the Royal Bedfordshire Yeomanry had lost both of their close support tanks. Sergeant Ross's tank, Alpha 1-1, also took some hits, but managed to stay in the fight, only suffering light damage. Things had reached something of a stalemate now. George 1-1 had been knocked out, and I didn't see any of the crew bail out. I assumed they were all dead. Of course, I now know that they were. At some point, Major Roberts called in an airstrike right on the enemy's forming up position where they were preparing to attack once again. The enemy had laid a smoke screen, and this actually acted as an aiming marker for the Hurricane to drop its single 500-pound bomb. An enemy anti-aircraft gun tried to shoot it down but failed, and the bomb went off with an almighty crack, shaking the ground beneath us. The attackers had taken very heavy losses. Their vehicles lay knocked out or burning all over the field, but their support guns were still engaging the British forces defending the town. These were starting to take a toll on the British lives. A renewed effort was launched by the enemy to get in amongst the British positions. They charged over the open fields, and with Lieutenant Fraser's tank engaging with the machine guns. The men of 4 platoon out on the left now began to press in on the enemy flank, engaging with assault guns and anti-tank guns. However, heavy fire sent them reeling back, and they lost quite a few men in the sections. In fact, almost the entire section was wiped out, with many men left bleeding in the field. In the end, it was the lone remaining 3-inch mortar that began to engage the enemy guns into this area. But without having any kind of eyes on the enemy guns, they could only fire harassing shots. Eventually, Lieutenant Davis, of 4 platoon, began to move forwards. He had with him some medics, and he had to help his men who were left in the field bleeding. Unfortunately, this little group of brave men, led by Lieutenant Davis, would not make it. They themselves would all be killed as they attempted to help their comrades. The situation was such now that enemy anti-tank guns kept the British tanks pinned down, unable to move out of cover, whilst the enemy assault guns continued to engage the British infantry, slowly but surely taking its toll on them. However, the 3-inch mortar was doing a very good job. Slowly but surely, one by one, it was taking out the enemy weapons. Nevertheless, British losses continued to mount. Believing they now had the British suppressed, the enemy once again launched a mad charge across the open. But one of the British infantry hiding behind a stone wall leapt up and engaged at very close range the attacking German forces. The assaulting infantry were decimated by this attack, their support guns unable to help them. The tanks also added their machine guns and anti-tank guns to the fire. Out on the right flank, Corporal Richardson's tank continued to engage the enemy 20mm gun that had been fighting almost the entire battle. First, the tank would move into cover, under fire from the 20mm, and then the 20mm would also move into cover when the tank moved out to engage that. However, at last, a carefully aimed 2-pounder shot from Corporal Robertson's tank destroyed a large ammo cache behind the gun, knocking out his crew. With the infantry attack defeated, with heavy loss of life to the enemy, and their assault guns and support guns now having fell mostly quiet, largely due to the efforts of the 3-inch mortar and of the tank men, the battle was effectively over. Some enemy forces that had managed to infiltrate into the town remained, but mostly the fight was done. The town had been held, to the cost of 38 British casualties, of which 16 were killed, plus 1 tank had been destroyed, shot up so badly that it would be uncoverable, and the entire crew had been killed. Furthermore, a 3-inch mortar had also been lost. But the enemy had came off far worse. They'd suffered 205 casualties, of which at least half are believed to have been killed, and they lost 18 vehicles and support weapons in the fight. Most of these were armoured cars and assault guns and anti-tank guns, but a small number of tanks were also knocked out. But the line had been held by the British, and that was what mattered here. This action would help stem the enemy advance in their renewed offensive into the Allied lines.